Hey everybody, welcome back to Coach All Writes. In today's video, we're going to be talking about how to cite sources in a synthesis essay to help you prepare for your upcoming AP Lang exam. Before we talk about how to cite sources in a synthesis essay, I would love it if you would take a second to hit that subscribe button and also turn on the notifications by clicking the bell. Doing so helps my channel grow and it ensures that I can continue to produce AP Lang tutorial videos to help teachers and students like you. Also, if you are a TikTok user, I would love it if you would follow Coach Hall Writes on TikTok. I give short tutorial videos over there as well, and I love answering student questions, so be sure to follow me over on that platform. And as always, if you're looking for additional resources, be sure to check out the description box below. With a synthesis essay, it's important to remember that you need to cite 3 different sources throughout your essay. If you cite the same source more than once, it's 2 citations, but it still only counts as 1 source. For example, if we're looking at your essay and you cite source A, and then we have source B, and then we see another citation for source A, and that's it, you have 3 citations, but that's not 3 sources because you cited source A twice. So in order for that to be 3 sources, we'd have to add another source. So as you're looking through your essay, before you turn it in or before you move on, if it's exam day, make sure that you have cited 3 different sources. Later on in this video, we're going to talk about parenthetical citations. That's a way for you to easily cite your sources. It's easy for the person reading your essay to see that you have clearly cited those sources, but you want to make sure that it's 3 different sources. For each synthesis prompt, you're typically provided with anywhere from 6 to 8 sources. So using 3 of the sources is approximately half of the ones provided. You do not actually need to use all of the sources given. This might be a little bit different than what you hear in other AP classes. For instance, sometimes in AP history classes, students are encouraged to cite all the sources, but AP Lang is a little bit different. You don't get any bonus point or extra credit if you cite all the sources. It is not part of the rubric to cite all the sources. In fact, sometimes trying to include all the sources actually detracts from your line of reasoning. So don't try to cram in all the sources. Just make sure that you've cited at least 3. If I'm being honest, most of my students tend to cite 4, and I think that's plenty. Now, one question that I'm often asked is, can I cite myself as a source? When they're looking for citations in your essay, they're looking for the provided sources. So you can't add sources. You can't cite yourself or even an outside source that might be relevant. If you want to include this information, it could possibly be commentary, but you can't add sources. You have to work with the ones provided on exam day. In order to cite sources, you need evidence. So let's talk about what types of evidence you're allowed to have and what you should do when trying to select your evidence. For a synthesis essay, there are 2 main types of evidence: direct quotes and paraphrase. So a direct quote is going to be quoted exactly from the text. You might need to make slight changes. For instance, you might need to change a pronoun or a verb in order to make it fit the sentence that you're putting it in. If so, just put that changed word in brackets. The square brackets will indicate that you've changed the word. But other than that, a direct quote should be copied exactly as it's written in the passage. A paraphrase, though, is when you take the information from the source and you put it in your own words. Whether you're using a direct quote or a paraphrase, be sure that you include a proper citation. I'll show you how to do that in just a second. For direct quotes, it's typically easier to select shorter quotes because you want to embed these or integrate these into a sentence of your own. I typically call it embedded evidence. Other teachers call it integrated evidence. We mean the same thing. Embed means to take something and put it into something else. So you're taking someone else's words and putting it into a sentence of your own. Therefore, as you're annotating, be sure to look for quotes that are approximately 3 to 8 words long. If it's a short quote, it's easier to embed into a sentence. You definitely don't want a quote that is longer than 15 words. In fact, 15 words is on the long side. Typically, when I see students select a quote that's 12 to 15 words long, they could actually scale that quote back by selecting key phrases from the quote. So we definitely want to err on the side of shorter quotes because these are easier to embed. And also, if you have quotes that are too long, it's going to throw off your evidence to commentary ratio. It's important to include evidence. You definitely need specific evidence in your essay, but ideally we want more commentary than evidence. So if you have a long quote, it's going to throw off that ratio. Also, a long quote isn't your own words, and so it's kind of detracting from your voice in the essay. And long quotes take longer to write. And so, in some sense, it's kind of a waste of time. Short quotes are the way to go. Now, as you're selecting your evidence, the goal is to choose quotes that you could seamlessly integrate into a sentence of your own. I'm going to show you how to do that. But one tip I have for you is to, as you're reading the sources, underline words or phrases that stand out to you, phrases that you think you could easily include in a sentence of your own. This does take practice, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes, and then you get more practice integrating your evidence. You'll know that a quote is seamlessly integrated if you're able to read the sentence aloud and people wouldn't be able to tell what was quoted versus what was your own words. And while this does take practice, this is a valuable academic skill that you could use in future classes, not just AP Lang. I like to use the acronym ICE to help students remember how to embed evidence. So I in ICE stands for introduce. We want to lead into the quote. There should be at least one word before the quotation marks in order to properly embed the quote. C stands for cite, so you need to include the evidence and provide a citation. And then E is for explain, which is basically your commentary or your analysis. It's when you analyze the why, the how, or the so what. Keep in mind that commentary can be included in the same sentence as evidence, but typically because we want more commentary than evidence, you might need multiple sentences of commentary. Now you'll notice here that it says no freestanding quotes. A freestanding quote is basically when a student just drops a quote into the essay. So one sentence will end and then we'll see quotation marks and we'll just have the quote and there's no other words around it that are the student's own words. This is actually very jarring for your reader and it's a bit faux pas in academic writing. So that's why we want to use the ICE method. We want to put at least one word, if not more, in front of the quotes. You'll notice that the C in the ICE mnemonic stood for cite. So you have to actually include your evidence and provide a parenthetical citation. On the cover page of the synthesis prompt, you're going to see a list of the sources. You can cite them as source A, or you can just use the author's last name. The College Board is going to provide both options on that cover page. So just be consistent. If you're going to choose source A, then do that for all of your sources. If you're going to go by the author's last name, use that method for all your sources. If you go back and forth, it gets a little bit confusing for the person reading your essay. So even though they'll be able to figure it out, make sure that for your parenthetical citations, you're being consistent. Now, this is just personal preference here as a teacher, but when my students are writing synthesis essays in class, it's easier for me if they just call it source A and are consistent that way because seeing source A stands out more. And also, for whatever reason, as a teacher, I remember the sources by their letter name. And so I tell my students to use source A, source B, source C for their citations, but it is okay to use the author's last name or the other provided information that the College Board lists on that cover page. So what exactly is a parenthetical citation? A parenthetical citation is when the source is cited in parentheses at the end of the sentence, and the period goes outside the second parenthesis. You use parenthetical citations in MLA format, APA format, and other citation styles. So it's possible that if you've written a paper in MLA or APA format, you've seen this style before. Now, for exam purposes, the citation just says source A, but if you're doing a full research paper, make sure you look up how to properly cite in the format that you choose, whether it's APA or MLA, because there are specific ways to cite different sources for research papers, but for the synthesis essay, source A is fine. We also want to talk about what to avoid when citing evidence. It's not wrong to say, according to source B. This does count as a citation, but honestly, this method of integrating sources is not as nuanced as desired. And if we're thinking about life beyond the AP Lang exam here, we want to help you incorporate your sources in a very effective way for future research papers too. So we want to try to avoid according to source B because it calls a little bit too much attention to the source. So here's a quick fix for it though. Instead of saying according to source B, try to use the original source's credentials. So, for example, you might say something like, according to a 2017 New York Times article. You could even give the title of the article if you wanted to. Or let's say you're quoting a particular person, maybe even somebody that the author of your article quoted in their article. You could say, according to, and then you give the person's full name, especially if it is the first time that you're referencing them. And then you could give their credentials. So are they an award-winning brain surgeon? Are they an acclaimed teacher? Give the person's credentials because that adds credibility. Both of these lead-ins read better than simply saying according to source B. So if you're writing a synthesis essay, try one of these methods if you're getting stuck leading into your evidence. Now remember, you still want to include a citation at the end of the sentence though. So even if you say, according to a 2017 New York Times article, you're still going to put the parenthetical citation at the end of the sentence. Part of the reason why the citation goes at the end is because it's less distracting. Sometimes if we put the citation in the middle of the sentence, then it's a little bit distracting and it interrupts the flow of the sentence. Here is a picture of a handout that I give my students to help them with synthesis essays. I wanted to tell you some of the tips that I give them. One is to make sure that you're selecting your best or strongest evidence to prove your claim. If you're going to include a direct quote, make sure that you're copying it exactly as it appears in the text. And like I said before, if you need to make changes, you can use those square brackets to indicate that you changed a word, like maybe a verb or a pronoun, to make it grammatically correct for the sentence. But other than that, we want to leave it as is. I've also included an example here of how to embed evidence, but let's take a look at it in a bigger format. So here is the same sentence that was on the previous slide. It says, Daniel Shepard, senior lecturer at the University of Technology in Auckland, claims sleep is vital to an organism, suggesting that if humans do not get enough sleep, they will not be able to complete daily tasks well. This is an example of embedded evidence. So you can see that at the beginning of the sentence, in that lighter blue font, we have the person's name and their credentials. In the dark blue font, you can see that we have the short quote. It's just 4 words, so it's easy to embed. And at the end of the sentence, in that dark blue, we have source C with the period outside of the parentheses. Now, the gray part of the sentence, starting with suggesting that if, that's actually commentary. Now, if I were writing this in a paragraph, I would want at least one more sentence, ideally 2 more sentences of commentary. But you can see here that evidence and commentary can go in the same sentence. So this is just one example of how to embed your evidence into a sentence of your own. Let's look at some other examples of how to include evidence and a proper citation. So in the top example, it says citing a visual text. On the AP Lang exam, you're guaranteed at least 1 visual text. Many prompts have 2. If you're looking for more information on how to cite a visual text, I do have a separate video on this and a corresponding blog post, which I will link in the description box below. A visual text is something like a pie chart, a bar graph, maybe a photograph or a comic strip. Now, sometimes students really like to see these because they're like, oh, good, I don't have to read a long article. And that is true, but sometimes it's difficult to figure out how to use the visual text. So we want to try to connect the visual text with one of the other sources. One tip I have for you is if you encounter a visual text early on in your packet, like let's say it's source A or source B, sometimes it's hard to know how to use that source. So you might want to actually just skip it for the time being and come back to it after you've read the other sources. With a visual text, you're probably going to need to paraphrase what you see happening, especially if it's like a comic strip or a photograph. However, sometimes there are things that you can actually quote. For instance, there might be data on a bar graph or a pie chart that you can include in a sentence of your own. So here's an example of that. It says, when converting fuel to electricity, wind energy is 1,164% efficient, whereas coal, which only costs $2 less to produce 1 MWH of electricity, is only 29% efficient, source F. Okay, so notice that the sentence does not end until after the citation. The period goes outside the second parenthesis. So we have some paraphrased evidence from a chart here. Including quantitative data like facts or statistics or even concrete examples can be very helpful in proving the logic behind your argument. So I definitely encourage you to look for logical evidence, things like statistics or facts or real world examples. Remember that we can also paraphrase evidence. So this means that we're putting it in our own words. If you have a really long quote, or if you find the quote is difficult to integrate into a sentence of your own, it's possible that paraphrasing it might be easier for you. Now, I personally like to see at least 1 or 2 quotes per paragraph. I don't mind paraphrased evidence, but sometimes an entire essay with only paraphrased evidence seems like a summary. So I would like to see my own students incorporate direct quotes when they can and paraphrases when it's appropriate. So here's an example of what that could look like. Opponents and skeptics of wind farms commonly cite adverse health effects, such as headaches and lack of sleep, as a reason not to establish a wind farm. While such claims are anecdotal at best, one cannot dismiss these concerns without due consideration. And then you see that we have the exact same citation method. It says source C in parentheses, and the period goes outside the second parenthesis. So in this case, some of the key words from the source would be things like headaches, lack of sleep, even the word anecdotal. But because I put it in my own words, this is a paraphrase and not a direct quote. Now, you might be wondering, am I allowed to cite more than one source in the same sentence? And the answer is yes. In fact, some students can do this quite well. It's a way to put those sources in conversation with each other. So there's a couple different ways that students commonly do this for the AP Lang exam. You might say something like sources A and D, or you might say source A, semicolon, source D. Both are fine. You want to make sure that you're citing them in the order that they appear in the sentence. So in this case, source A would be the first quote and source D would be the second quote. It's not about alphabetical order. It's about which one appears in the sentence first. Another question that students sometimes ask is, can you cite sources in an intro? And typically an intro, especially for a timed synthesis essay, consists of context or background info and a thesis. I typically tell my students to have a short intro, ideally 1 or 2 sentences plus a thesis, because I want them to focus on their body paragraphs, because that's where the bulk of their points are going to be coming from. That's where their evidence and commentary are going to be. That being said, there are times when it might be appropriate to cite a source in your intro, especially if there is some kind of important fact or statistic that you want to include as a way to lead into the topic. Ask yourself, is this the best place for this information? If the answer is yes, then go ahead and cite a source in your introduction. But I don't want you to feel like you have to, because quite frankly, it's pretty rare that I see a student cite a source in their intro. Typically, the citations come in the body paragraphs. So yes, it's allowed, but no, it's not very common. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you found the content helpful, please do me a favor and hit that like button. Also, double check that you are subscribed with your notifications turned on. That really helps my channel grow. And like I said at the beginning, if you are a TikTok user, I would love it if you would follow me at Coach Hall Writes over on TikTok as well. Until next time, happy writing.